Hey listeners, today is the first video podcast and my guest is Marilyn Nutter, and Marilyn has been on the podcast before. She was on episode 35 with April White. That was back in 2021, and so Marilyn is my guinea pig today, and I appreciate her being willing to do that. And we are going to talk about her book, Hope for Widows, Reflections on Mourning, Living, and Change. And Marilyn has an incredible story of how she lost her husband of 42 years, and she's written this book to try to encourage widows. And I don't want you to turn this off if you're thinking, well, I'm not a widow, so this doesn't have anything to do with me. We're going to talk about how we can be prepared, because you never know what life has in store, and also how we can encourage other people that a lot of us probably have people in our lives who are widows that are struggling, and how we can help them. So, Marilyn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
So tell us a little bit of your story so we can get started before we get into what the book has.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's hard for me to believe that it's actually been 12 years since my husband passed away. We were out in Idaho. I have 3 daughters, and one of my daughters and her family at the time lived in Idaho. He was a pastor of a church, and it was Christmas time. It was also my grandson's birthday. And when you fly across the country, you need to make the most of it. So we were going out for the dedication of the building, we were going out for a birthday party, and we were going out to celebrate Christmas. Well, we got through the birthday party and the church dedication, the building dedication. And it was a couple of days later, actually, it was the day before, it was the 23rd of December, the day before Christmas Eve. And my daughter and husband went off to the church because she was the director for the children's choir, and he went off with her to help with the sound. And during that time, he was experiencing some chest pains. And they came home, and he just didn't feel good, and they called a doctor friend of theirs and said he needs to go to the ER. So he did go to the ER, and he was having a major heart attack, and they had to life flight him to Spokane, Washington. We were in a small town, and they were not equipped to do what they thought they were going to do, which was stents. So we drove to Spokane, about 100 miles away. He was life flighted. And as he went off on the stretcher, I said to him, I'll see you soon. Well, that was the last time I saw him, because he died during the procedure, and it was 2 days before Christmas, and we were 2,000 miles from home, and that was probably the hardest day of my life.
I'm sure. So one thing, Marilyn and I met at a writer's group, and do you know what year? Do you remember what year you?
Well, I moved here 9 years ago, so do the 2014.
Okay,
yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So Marilyn came to the writer's group, and she wanted to write a book for widows, and we would bring pieces for critique. And for some reason, it seems like I always ended up in Marilyn's critique group, and I always ended up being the one that would read. And every time I would read, I would cry. And I felt so bad that I would cry every time, because I knew Marilyn wanted a good reader for it. But I think that just speaks to Marilyn's writing and how you are able to convey the emotion and the grief and everything that you felt. But the thing that, for a long time, Marilyn was trying to get her book published. And so many publishers didn't want to talk to her. And I was just amazed that, there are so many widows, and nobody wanted to talk about it, because it's a topic. I mean, nobody wants to be a widow. Nobody wants to talk about this. But you were persistent in that, and you kept going. And I just appreciated that about you. So what kept spurring you on to finally write and publish your book?
Well, it's interesting. You really have described it accurately. The responses I would get from editors were along the lines of excellent writing, but we don't think there's a market for it. And that really bothered me because as I lived in this chapter of widowhood, I was meeting more and more widows. I was meeting more and more women who were married one day and widowed the next. And the statistics are that there are 11 million widows in the United States.
Wow.
And that every day, 1,000 women become widowed.
Wow.
And it's not, I think it partly was the idea that the stereotype, you know, she's the little elderly lady who probably lives in assisted living. Or even if she lives at home, a neighbor or her daughter will pick her up to go grocery shopping, and she probably has white hair and those kinds of things. But really, the average age of a widow is 59. And I know I facilitate a grief group at my church, and I've had widows who were 85 years old, but I've also had young moms in their 30s who are widowed and everything in between. So what spoke to me so much was really the error that there is a market for it, because women want to be encouraged. They want to know they're not alone. And so I wrote, and I kept on getting, I don't want to even say rejected. The work was declined.
I like that better.
The work was declined. But I'd go to writers' conferences, and I'd have, you know how we go. We pay for critiques, and we have mature writers, seasoned writers who will read and then give us feedback. And they always said, you know, certainly there were things to fix, but for the most part, they would say, that one person told me, this is golden, this is so good, you need to continue to do this. And I continued to get the work declined. And one day, I actually entered a writing contest. And I thought, I don't have anything to lose. And it was with Books and Such literary management agency, and it was hook us with your hook. What, you know, a hook is the premise of the book. Like what is going to want, what am I going to, what is this telling me that's going to want me to read more? So I had to write a hook in 25 words or less, and I submitted it, and I found out I was one of the 10 finalists, and then I ended up winning the whole contest.
Wow.
But the point was, there was no promise of representation, but the agent who had selected mine from the pool of applicants called me, and she said, I'm the one who read it. I read your proposal, and I'd like to represent you. And she told me something. She said, you know, I read your proposal through two sets of eyes, pairs of eyes. She said, I read it as a literary agent, but I read it through the eyes of my sister, who's a young widow. And the things that you mention in here, I know she has gone through. So we want to do this. And really, I had such an advocate with Rachel Kent, who is my agent, and she represented it, and Our Daily Bread saw the need, and so they picked it up, and it was published this past January. So it was exciting, and I know when April and I were on the podcast 2 years ago now, one of the verses that guided us, which I think is true in all of life, comes from Isaiah 60:22. When the time is right, I, the Lord, will make it happen. And so I won't deny that I wasn't disappointed every time I got the letter saying no, 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 but I also knew that when the time was right, it would happen. Yeah. And it did. Yeah.
That is so, and you know, God had that editor in mind to help you, or agent in mind to help you. And, you know, I don't know how recent it was that, you know, did you say sister?
Her sister. It was her sister.
That had lost her husband.
It was a couple of years.
So the timing, you know, it probably, God knows.
And I also like to believe, really, that when the book came out in January, there was one widow who needed it. And had the book come out 6 years ago, she was probably married, and she didn't need it. So it's all in honoring God's timing and what He has in mind.
Yeah, that is really good. I know some of the things that you would share in the writers group that I'm not sure if you shared these in your book or not, but one thing that stood out to me was the empty chair, and when people would invite you over to dinner. So can you talk about that?
The empty chair. There is an empty chair that stares at us all the time. You know, it's in my home all the time. But I recall it was fairly early in my widowhood that I was invited to someone's home for a meal, and everyone there was a couple except me, which is also a very hard place to be when you've lived as a couple for over 42 years. And we're in I went to a grief seminar one time, and it was Alan Wolfelt, who's Center for Loss and Grief out in Colorado, and he said, we live in a Noah's Ark culture.
What does that mean?
Noah's Ark. Everyone's a couple.
Okay. I didn't think about that. Okay.
I didn't either when he said that. We're in a Noah's Ark culture. And I thought, what does this mean? Animals? But he said, from the beginning of time, it's not good that man is alone. Yeah. Adam and Eve. And, and 2 by 2 in the ark. And he said, so you are surrounded by couples. And I was surrounded by couples at that dinner, except next to me was an empty chair. And that was very hard. It's hard to ignore it because you're, as I said in the piece in the book, that I'm stretching my arm to give the vegetables to the person on my right at an angle because there's no one next to me to pass them to, know. And it's very stark. It's very uncomfortable. And when I wrote the book, initially I wrote it to support widows. I wanted them to see that you're not alone. Right. When you're experiencing these secondary losses and a number of other things that I talk about in the book, most of us we all experience secondary losses, but a lot of the other examples in there, I wanted them to see that someone else shares it and knows and understands. Even though grief is personal and it's unique, there are experiences that we all share. And then as I got into writing more, I realized it was also educational for people who are not widowed. Yeah. For them to say, oh, in fact, when someone read that, they said, one of the reviews indicated, I've become more aware in how I have to relate to widows now. I will no longer seat them next to an empty chair. And I wanted them to see that there are things you can be aware of and things you can do or not do, things you can say and not say, and sensitivity. Not that you're sheltering anyone, but if you can avoid someone from being hurt, why not? Right. And so I wrote the book for 2 groups of people. I wrote it for widows, but I wrote it, as I say, for people who know and love widows so that they can have a little insight into what a widow's life might be like and how changed it is. And an empty chair is one of those examples.
Well, and it really made me think too, because when you're used to living life as a couple, you don't realize the power of somebody just being alone and how that impacts them and makes them feel that much more alone in a situation like that. So, I wish I could remember, but you had so many different great ideas on how you can help during situations like that, things that you can do to make widows feel more comfortable or include them more in things. And so can you share some of those ideas?
How to support and be a friend to a widow?
That, or if you're in a situation like a lot of times I think we almost avoid inviting a widow because we're afraid, okay, we are all couples and I don't want her to feel left out, or whatever it might be.
Well, I think one of the things is the conversation. Yeah, is important. Our conversation is always important. If we're not, whether it's speaking with or to widows, but one of the things I hear is no one says my husband's name. They're afraid that if I speak about their husband, they're going to start crying or whatever. Avoiding them, avoiding the name is very hard on a widow, because it's as if they're not important and they're not remembered. I received a Christmas card from a friend of mine, and she said, I'm thinking and praying for you this December because I know it's not only Christmas, but it's when Randy went to heaven. And she said, I still remember him so well. And that meant so much to me that she took the time to say something like that, and or tell a story. Now, you have to respect where the widow is in her grief, and it's not just to say it, but not to avoid it if it's part of a conversation. I think inviting them and giving them, respecting whether they want to say no or yes. You know, some women will jump at the chance all the time. Some women will say, I don't know. I think, I always say, I'll get back to you. And that's the advice I give, so that you're not jumping into something like that couple's dinner when I was very uncomfortable, and I am not avoiding something that would be fun and good to do. So I think you would respect their answer, respect whether they want you to pick them up or not pick them up. Maybe they want an exit plan. Maybe they want to say, I'm going to try and go here, but if I have to leave early, I will. But if someone drove you, you're stuck.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think also when you invite them out, I had one woman in my grief support group. We often tell them, if people invite you, go if you can, because if you always say no, they're going to stop inviting you.
That's right.
Which is true. And she came to me afterwards and she said, I need to tell you something. She said, I get invited almost every Sunday to go out to lunch. She said, but I can't afford it. And I said, do they invite you to expensive places, or where are you going, And she said, well, for me it's expensive because, I only have one Social Security check now.
Oh, gosh.
And I said, well, let's come up with some ideas here. And I suggested maybe she invite people over for a potluck and everybody brings something, or tell them, you know what, I can't go for lunch today, but how about coffee next Saturday morning? That would be in your budget. So be sensitive to what you're asking them to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't think about that because most people aren't living on a limited income like that. And they probably didn't at all consider that she couldn't afford to go out to lunch. Yeah, and that's so sad. And you know what? Well, okay, so say if there is a lady that is a widow and you want her to be included in your lunch, because I know a lot of people go out to lunch after church on Sundays. How do you handle, like, if you want to pay for their lunch whenever, like, you don't want to offend them or hurt their feelings or whatever, but you want them to know, hey, I would love to do that for you if you
I would probably just say something like, well, for instance, I invited a new widow out to breakfast in a couple of weeks. I didn't tell her this, but it's the first time I'm meeting with her, and I'm just going to pick up the check and say, oh, I want to do this for you. I just want to do this today.
Yeah.
I just want to do it this one time, so that they don't feel like a charity case, and they don't feel like every time I don't even want to go out with her again because I don't want her to pick up my lunch, But I think if you made light of it and say, I really want to treat you. I want the blessing of taking you out.
Yeah.
And doing that.
I think, that's a good way to look at it, because it's so hard. You don't know what to do. You don't want them to feel bad, but I think that's a good way to handle it. So as I was flipping through your book and looking at some of the different chapters you have, one of them is about not being prepared. And, even though maybe a lot of my listeners are not widows, you don't necessarily think, most of the time when you become a widow, it's unexpected, I would think. But when you have to think about hard things in order to be prepared in case your husband, say he does pay the bills, or in my case, I pay the bills, but my husband knows all of the financial, the money market and stocks. I don't know any of that, unfortunately, but that's more his thing, and I don't enjoy it, and I don't really want to be involved in it, but I'll pay the bills. So, what do you recommend to women, just as a way of being smart and not trying to be, foreboding or anything like
Right.
that, but just to make sure that you're prepared in case something like that does happen? Because I know you had something happen that the Holy Spirit kind of led you to ask a question that helped you
Right.
through your experience.
It was, well, my husband was the one who paid the bills,
Mm-hmm.
and he did all the finances, and that was his expertise. I mean, I didn't have an interest in it. I didn't think, oh, I really want to do this. No, I just left it with him. And, but he had been gone in November overseas teaching. And I knew tax season was coming up, and at the end of December we had to have everything organized, and he did the taxes too.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, I'll just put everything in file folders. I'll just organize it so when he needs the information, that it will be accessible and organized for him. So he came home, and I always did a lot of projects when he was gone because it kept me busy. And, like he'd notice, oh, the bookshelf's reorganized or whatever it was. And I said, I have one thing to show you. And I opened the filing cabinet. And I said, I organized all of this for you for the taxes. And I said, but there is one more thing I think I need to know. I know he gave me the passwords for the banking in case I needed to get into accounts while he was gone. I said, but I need to know, what am I supposed to do in the event that you die? I don't know whatever possessed me to say it. It was November, and he wrote everything out for me. He said, this is who you call, this is what you do, and he had everything itemized. And it was 3 weeks later that I needed that information.
Wow.
And, grief brain is a very real thing.
Yeah.
You are foggy. You can't think straight. You are sad. And I had to learn a lot of things right out of the gate. But one thing I didn't have to learn was try and scramble and figure out, where is this? What's the password for that? And whatever. I wasn't about to make any major decisions about finances at all, but yet I had the resource there that he had written for me. So I would advise that, just to have it. And there are other areas too. I mean, I have friends that don't know how to pump gas. And
wow.
I mean, in our grief support group, I remember the sweet little lady, we talk about, what did you do this week that you can celebrate? And she said, I pumped gas for the first time.
Wow. Oh my
And
goodness.
that gives you such independence. I mean, if you
Yeah.
have to wait for someone to fill your car.
Right.
And a couple of my friends, their husbands are out, just like that little lady did. And so be prepared. You may not, there are a lot of things in life we don't like to do.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, but I guarantee it. If you don't know how to do it, when you have to do it, you're really not going to like it, because you can't focus. You can't think straight. And so be prepared. I mean, my widowed friends, we do a lot with YouTube, like fixing flappers on commodes and things that we think we can manage. And we'll always say, my daughter, there's a chapter in there, a story where my daughter Heather said, Mom, you're adding to your resume. Pretty soon you're going to manage an apartment complex, But those were things I never had to do.
Right.
But those are things I had to learn to do.
Right.
Because you can't call someone and expect them to come over in 5 minutes.
I know. And a lot of times it's something that you really need.
I was on the phone with my son-in-law one time. I said, my microwave will not shut off. What is the problem? And he's in Pennsylvania, and he's going through it with me. And finally, he said, just unplug it right now, because we'll see tomorrow. And it's true. I didn't want to start a fire.
Right, yeah.
But be prepared. As much as you don't like it, think about what's essential.
Yeah.
What's essential.
And I guess, because on the surface you think, oh, essential things are, how to get in your bank account, things like that. But then there's just the everyday things like that you don't necessarily, that's not going to pop to the front of your mind thinking, oh, that's essential. My washing machine is leaking.
Yeah.
What am I going to do? Because you have to fix that immediately,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or something like that. So I guess maybe for maybe a month, every day, just ask yourself, or even a week,
mm-hmm.
what's essential that I needed to know today?
That I should have known, and I'm sorry I didn't.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was like we just experienced some cold weather here in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Okay, and everybody goes through keep your faucets dripping, you know, get the covers for the outside faucets, open your cabinets so that the heat goes into the pipes, you know, and those are things, and every one of my widowed friends says, that's something my husband would have done. I wouldn't have had to give it a second thought.
Right.
And now that's so part of when I say I wrote the book, not just for widows to give those illustrations, but for people who know widows, whether it's the daughter of a widow, the sister, a neighbor, a friend, is to realize that when a husband dies, God does not give the widow a 48-hour day.
Yeah.
Because really what I'm doing is all the work I always did, plus I'm doing fulfilling all the responsibilities he did.
Right.
And it's to be sensitive to that. I mean, I had a friend in my church back in Charlotte. I remember when I was, it was a change of seasons. And he had said to me, do you need some help now that the seasons are changing? Anything you need to know about your yard or anything? And I thought that was so sensitive and so kind.
Absolutely.
Because seasonally, there's always another new responsibility.
Yeah.
And so that is something I wanted to raise the awareness of for people who know widows, to read it and see, yeah, there are a lot of things that she's dealing with. It's not just the physical and the emotional loss of her husband, but she has all these extra things she never had to do before.
Yeah.
And often has to learn how to do them.
Right. And a lot of times you are older, and the older you get, the harder it is to learn this stuff.
Oh, I write steps. I have steps.
But thank goodness for you two, because, you know, that's what, it's so funny. This really doesn't have any, well, I guess it does have to do with widowhood. But so I hosted Thanksgiving at my house this year. I'd never hosted Thanksgiving at my home before. And so, but I've never cooked a turkey, ever. And so I told my mom, I said, I'll have Thanksgiving, but I don't know how to cook a turkey. She's like, I will cook the turkey. If you'll have it at your house, I'll cook the turkey. And so she cooks, I think it was like a 21-pound turkey. And she gets my son-in-law because they live right around the corner from her, and he picks it up and he brings it to my house. And so there's this beautiful turkey sitting on my kitchen counter. And I'm like, who's going to cut the turkey? And that's what my dad always used to do. He used to cut, and they had this electric knife, and Mom's like, do you have an electric knife? And I said, no, I don't cut turkeys. I don't have an electric knife. And so my son-in-law, bless his heart, we always kind of throw him in the middle of everything. And I said, Wes, can you cut a turkey? And he's like, no, I've never cut a turkey before. So he pulls it up on YouTube, and he sits there and watches it a few minutes, and he cuts the turkey, and he did an excellent job. I was so proud of him for stepping in there and doing that. But you don't think, I mean, that's one of the
examples, sure.
Right. You don't think, oh, Dad's always the one that cut the turkey. And so I know it's been 3 years, and my nephew also, he helped my dad cut the turkey. But he wasn't there for Thanksgiving. So just things like that you just don't think about every day.
A maintenance schedule on a car, for example.
Oh, gosh.
Those things that men just kept track of.
Right.
And would do those things. Or the maintenance on your heating and air conditioning. And so all these things that don't go away.
Right.
But now you've got to develop the expertise for them. And it would be helpful if friends would rise up, not necessarily to pay for things, but to give you the advice. Another thing, for instance, is having repairmen in your house. If you're a widow, a woman alone, you want a trustworthy person.
Definitely.
And offering that, say, this is the person I use for this. Yeah. Maybe you would want to call him.
Yeah. I think that is, because even though my husband, of course, is still alive, but sometimes people come during the day, and and I live out.
You're right, you do.
And I get a little nervous sometimes so I can't imagine if you lived alone. Then there's that added thought of, well, what if they came back at night because now they know the layout of my house or whatever. Right. So there's all these things that we shouldn't worry about, but then you have to be extra precautious.
Well, you have to be cautious and responsible.
Right.
It's not that you're fearful. You just have to use your head.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, definitely. So tell us a little about the book, because you said that the book is arranged in a certain way that you really wanted it to be for the reader to get the most out of it.
Right. Well, the book really it has 65. I call them vignettes. They're stories, they're experiences, they're episodes, like the empty chair, for instance. What I did, some of the book came out of my personal journals, because I have journaled for years, and I would record an experience, or I'd record a Bible verse when I could. Now, initially, my brain was so clouded, I could hardly pray a sentence. I was in shock, and it was like staring, and what am I doing here? But once I was able to write some things, I just kept on doing this, and they evolved into pieces that I thought might be articles, is what happened. And Lori Hatcher, who was editor of a magazine at the time, I met her at a writer's conference, and she wanted me to write an article on grief. And she said, you could help somebody if you'd write an article about grief.
Yeah.
And that's when it evolved into, well, maybe I could help somebody if I wrote a book about grief.
Yeah.
And so I wrote it that way, with 65 real-life experiences that are fairly universal. Now, not everyone has a husband who died and had to be life-flighted. I realize that, but we all have that moment when we heard a physician say, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And so I have arranged it that way. It's not chronological. They are episodes that I've experienced, from traveling to looking through a sewing cabinet and seeing the colors of thread and saying, these were the representation of my life in the past, and they were also variable. And God was faithful there, and God's going to be faithful in my future. And so those are the kinds of stories that I tell. And there's a scripture with each one, though it's not a devotional book. But at the end, I ask the reader to reflect. Like, have you considered God's faithfulness in your past? What are you thinking about now? And can you journal about this? So that's the way I arranged it. And very interactive. I didn't want them to read my story and leave it there. I wanted them to read my story and write their story.
Yes.
So that it would be a path toward healing, and also a path where they felt supported and encouraged.
Yeah.
And then, as others were reading, like you say, I never knew that. I never thought about that.
Right.
And so to give them some insight.
And something that you've got in the back of the book, that when you started explaining it, I was like, oh, wow, yeah, that really is a good exercise when you say you write the character traits of God from A to Z. Am I saying it right?
Right, you are. There's an appendix in the back of the book. One of them is knowing God from A to Z, which I didn't mean to sound trite by any stretch, but it is. If you were to take the alphabet from A to Z and you were to think about a character trait of God that begins with A, what would you say? You'd say God is authentic. God is amazing. God is
all-knowing.
All-knowing, and then go to B. God is beautiful. And going through from A to Z, because one thing about God is he is constant. His character never changes.
Right.
And so anything I could say from A to Z about God will not change. And for D, he will always be dependable.
Yeah.
And E, he will always be excellent. And so it was an encouragement to sit and think, what could you say about God today? And you don't have to sit at one time and go from A to Z. Maybe today I want to do F and say, yep, today I need to know God is faithful. And so that was what I had desired for readers to do as they got to the back. And there's another section in the appendix where I take the prayers of the Apostle Paul. And I think there are 5 there that I've recorded when he's writing to the Ephesians and the Philippians and the Colossians. And in it, he never prays for anything physical. He's always praying for something spiritual. And it is, if you could fill your, when he says, I pray that you, okay, if you would fill your name in, I pray that Carol would, be filled with the knowledge of his will today. Which is what, one of the examples of his prayers. And you're praying God's words back to himself.
Yeah. And God, sometimes we don't understand or know God's will, but I feel like when we take Scripture, and it's especially a promise that God has given to us, not all the things in the Bible are written to us, but when we know that it's something that is written to us, and we pray it back to Him, I believe God honors those prayers.
Exactly.
Because He wants to hear, His words, us praying those back to Him, because we know it lines up with His will. So I think that's really a beautiful thing. So one thing I know that especially in the beginning, and even as time goes on, I feel like hope is something that might be a really hard thing to come by when you've lost a spouse, or even if it's, like when I lost my dad, it's a different grief. My mom lost her husband, but we children lost our dad. Exactly. My children lost their grandfather, and then their friends and all of that. So it's different levels, I guess, of the grief. But sometimes when you think about it, especially in the very beginning, it just seems like the hope is lost. And so what would you say, because I know that's one thing that you want this book to do, is to help people not just to move on,
right,
but to move towards something.
That's a great question, Carol. Let me just go back for a minute with something you said about how your grief is different. Your mother's grief for her husband is different than your grief for a father. I have 3 daughters, and their grief for their father was still very different from each other's because they knew their dad in different ways.
Right.
2 of my daughters were present when he died. Another one was clear across the country, so she wasn't even there. But they knew him in different ways. They were different ages. So everybody's grief is unique and personal. It's like snowflakes.
Right.
Widows in church. You may see 5 widows in church, and the only thing in common is that they've lost a husband. Their grief is like an individual snowflake, and yet the 5 women would be like a blanket of snow. So it is, you are right about that. But how do each of us still navigate to our source of hope, and how do we get there? Time doesn't heal, Jesus heals.
Right.
Okay? Time lessens the pain. It changes the shape of your grief. And early on, very early on, because it was December, my husband died on December 23rd. We flew back to Charlotte, had the memorial service on the 30th, and the next day we were front and center with another holiday, December 31st, New Year's Eve, which is a celebration, a party,
Right.
We certainly were not in that. But one thing I wanted to do was to take communion as a family in my home. And I mentioned it to my daughter, and my son-in-law is a pastor, and I said, I would like us to end the year this way, looking forward to hope. And we did. We took communion together, and when we finished, I said, this is where our hope lies. And I guess the Holy Spirit again gave me incredible strength, because I look back and think I really did that. But I did, and He did it for me, because our hope is not in, we say, oh, I hope it doesn't rain today because I rented a beach house, you
Yeah.
know, or I hope I can fit into my swimsuit after I ate all winter long. But that's wishful thinking, and that is speculative. But real hope is relying, I go back to A to Z, is relying on who God is and who he says he is.
Yeah.
And that he always keeps his promises. You know, one of the promises that I would say I rely on is grace for every day. You know, I look back and sometimes I will sit in my sunroom and I'm having my devotions in the morning and I'll look around and I'll say, I have done this for 12 years.
Yeah.
I've lived alone for 12 years. This is remarkable.
Yeah.
And yet God has sustained me for every day of those 12 years. And that's where our hope really rests. And that God keeps his promises. He says who he says. He's faithful. The verses that have been so significant in my life have come from Lamentations 3. At this I call to mind. It is because of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed. His compassions never fail. Great is his faithfulness. Do I get lonely? Absolutely. Do I sometimes say, oh, another Christmas without my husband? Yes. I welcomed 4 new grandchildren into our family as a single grandparent. He was present for the other 4. Does that hurt? Of course it does.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not saying that, oh, hope is resting in God and everything's wonderful. No, it's resting in God and knowing he loves me and knowing he's faithful and knowing he cares and knowing his grace is going to get me through.
So when you talk about loneliness, because I would venture to guess that that's probably one of the biggest things, especially older widows whose children have moved out, that is probably the biggest thing that widows struggle with. Would you agree?
I would agree 100%. I think that's number one.
So how do you get through the loneliness?
Well, there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. That's one thing. And of course, we live alone.
Yeah, right.
I think it hits you. It hits me every once in a while. It hits me, especially when I see other couples holding hands.
Yeah.
Or when I hear about couples doing this. There was a period of time early on in my grief when I couldn't even be on social media. I thought if I saw one more picture of date night with my love or going out for an anniversary trip, it was not sitting well with me.
Right.
Be totally transparent on that. And that too changes. You know, that changes over time. But the loneliness, I think, it's important to realize this. In the book, I talk about the fact that this is my assignment. God has given me this, just like he assigned me to be a mother. He assigned me to be a spouse. He assigned me to be a teacher. He assigns me, in this chapter, widowhood. And he'll meet my needs. He'll give me the grace I need. But I have to do something with it.
Right.
And for me, that has been certainly writing. It's fulfilled. God's call to write has been precious to me. But it's also finding other friends who are also widowed that I can travel with or do things with. It is realizing that there is a ministry with Bible study. It's being a grandmother and not having all those people meet my needs, so to speak, where I'm dependent on them, but realizing life can be full and life looks different.
Right.
And you do have purpose, because if I didn't have purpose, I wouldn't be here.
Right. Yeah.
You know, God is, working out his good purposes for me. And so I think living a life of isolation is not healthy.
Right.
Living in a pity party is not healthy. I will say if a person needs counseling, they should definitely seek it. Finding grief support groups is very helpful. I know Grief Share is very big in a lot of churches. Our church in Taylor's has a grief support group exclusively for spouses. It's only on spousal death. So we have a unique, that's the only thing we talk about,
right,
is what it's like. And there's value in being in those other groups. I mean, I was in one, and you thought, oh, this person lost their child and this one lost their sister and whatever. So you develop a lot of empathy for that. But I think if it suits you to try out a grief support group, do that. And you will get guidance to lean into life.
Yeah.
And moving. I think we talked before we recorded the big difference between moving on and moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And that, 16-year-old girls who break up with boyfriends move on, they find somebody else and whatever. But when you are widowed, you don't move on to forget.
Right.
Because you've been so shaped by your husband and your marriage. But you move forward in life thinking, this is my new chapter. What does God want to do in and through me in it?
Yeah, that's good. As you were talking, though, I was thinking, because as a daughter, sometimes you feel helpless to really help or know what to do. And so my mom, I'm trying to remember, it was before Christmas. It was sometime in the middle of December. She got COVID. And so here it was, she had to miss all this stuff because she had COVID. And the thing that was the hardest for her was being alone, because she got sick on like a Thursday. And so she was sick throughout the weekend. And then on Monday, she went to the doctor. Well, then the doctor said, well, you're testing positive on Monday, so that means you've got to be in quarantine until Saturday, I think, Friday or Saturday. So it was that long stretch of over a week that she was totally by herself. And I didn't know what to do. I mean, I would call her every day and try to, talk to her. But I could tell there was almost a desperation, like I need people so much. And I just felt helpless because I'm like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help in the best possible way. My daughter took a care package, to her house with some things, and that meant a lot to her. But the thing of being lonely, I couldn't help with that except with a phone call. And so, is there any advice that you could give through something like that? I know that's a really hard question.
That's a really hard question, because certainly if she had COVID, you couldn't be exposed.
Right.
And that was that kind of a situation. It is hard, and you are alone. I know that I fell twice, unrelated incidences, and I was actually in the hospital for one of those.
Oh, gosh.
And so I was by myself. And I had a very good friend who spent the night with me, actually, in the hospital. But otherwise, I was there. And it was one of those things, I honestly will tell you, that God's grace met me. It really, I don't want to say it wasn't hard. I mean, I broke my hip. It was hard.
Oh, my goodness.
It was hard, but I think it's something, it's similar to, for people who are afraid to public speaking, they anticipate, and it's awful. But then they get up there, they give the speech, and then they sit down, and it really wasn't so bad.
Right.
And I think anticipation is sometimes worse than because I used to think, what if I'm hospitalized? What if I have to do this? And yet I was, and it wasn't pleasant, but it was, okay, I'm here, and it's all right. But I guess to call, to FaceTime, to bring food over is helpful, because you do feel the being alone when you are sick is absolutely intensified.
Yes.
Because you know that my husband would have gotten my orange juice for me.
Right.
He would have fixed the meal. I would, whatever it was. And you realize there's nobody here but me.
Yeah. You have to depend on yourself. Yeah, but that's, I guess that's the thing that I worry about the most about my mom.
Mm-hmm.
Just, wanting to be there for her. And the thing is, a lot of times I feel very guilty. And I know that's not what she wants me to feel.
Right.
But I'm like, gosh, Lord, show me what I should do.
And that's a good place to start. Show me what she needs, because one of the things I talk about in the book is love languages. Some, depending on the way a woman, a widow, receives love may not be the way you give, may not be your love language.
Right.
You know, her love language may be service, and your love language is gifts.
Right.
And I remember one time with my mother-in-law, she said, I know you send me flowers. She said, I'd rather have you give me the money so I could pay someone to do my yard.
Oh.
And I said, okay. We thought we were brightening her day with flowers,
Yeah.
you know, and the same thing, you know. So that person may want you to help them take down the bins of from their attic so they could put up their Christmas decorations.
Yeah, that's a big one.
That's a big one. And you come over with a poinsettia.
Yeah.
And you say, I thought you'd enjoy this. Bye.
Yeah.
When really they think, can you carry the stuff down for me?
Right.
So I think that is one of the ways to think about helping a widow.
Yeah.
You know, our love languages are words and touch, and that's a big one because they don't get touch.
That's right.
A hug. If you're not a hugger, then that's going to be hard for you. I'm thankful I have my two little grandsons that live near me are huggers for me. But, you know, there's words and service and gifts and time, you know. Early on in my loss, my neighbor sat with me. She didn't say anything. She just sat with me and gave me her time. And it was company, you know, that I wasn't staring at my house by myself.
Yeah.
So those I think are things to think about. It's not, it's removing yourself in the way you want to do it.
Right.
And think, what is best going to serve her?
Yeah.
Would she like me to sit with her? Would she like a visit for 30 minutes or an hour?
Yeah.
Rather than have me just drop something off.
Right. Right.
You know.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. So as we're wrapping up this conversation, Marilyn, I know I interviewed you a couple of years ago, and I'm sure God has continued showing you things as you've continued walking through this journey. But is there anything that you would want to say to, first of all, the widow that's out there listening to this, of how you have, maybe something that you haven't mentioned yet that has really helped you to get through these last 12 years, and also something that you could share with somebody who doesn't know what to do. I know you've given a lot of good practical wisdom, but maybe there might be something else that you want to share with them.
Well, as far as getting through, it's time, your grief you'll not always, one of the pieces that I share in the book was early on looking out, much like today, where the trees are bare and everything looks so stark.
Yeah.
And God had spoken to me and said, you're not always going to look like those trees. You are going to change.
That's good.
And that is true. That it will be it's encouraging to know that you're not always going to be as sad as you are. You're not always going to feel as helpless. You're not even going to feel as lonely, as long as you do your part to get out there and make friends and be a friend.
Right.
And reach out to another widow. That is one of the things that I see in the group of women that I know who are widowed, is we are very much into, she's newly widowed. We need to reach out to her and be there for that person. The other thing is living in gratitude for what you do have, not for what you don't. And that is, I have a practice where I rewind my day and think about 5 things about my day that I'm thankful for. And they're not material things necessarily. Once in a while they might be, but it's like, oh, my tulips came up today. They're beautiful. And it's just having a perspective of gratitude. The last part of the book, I never intended to write it until my daughter suggested it to me, and she said, Mom, she said, people want to know where an author is right now. They want to know what you're doing now in your life, because it's been a while. And so the last segment of the book is called In Appreciation Of. And I share the things that I have appreciated as these 12 years now, well, 11 when the time it went to print, but had passed. And I said, my list isn't necessarily what your list is, because we're different. But if you would have your perspective learn to develop your perspective and gratitude and appreciation for what you have, and knowing God's character is always there for you. So that is probably what I would say, and I can't remember what your second part of the question was.
That was a really good answer, by the way. So for somebody who has a loved one who is a widow in their life, like I said, I know we've gone through a lot of things, but what would you want to end this conversation telling them?
What would I want to tell them? I would tell them, don't compare. If it's your mother, your sister, your aunt, a good friend, don't compare how they're grieving with the way someone else is grieving, because grief is very individualized. It's personal. They know things about their relationship with their spouse that were never part of your life.
Right.
So you don't know all the things that they're missing. You don't know all the frustrations they may have. To be patient, to ask. Don't assume. Ask them. Call them. You know, people do avoid widows. They do. They move away. I had some good friends that I never heard from anymore, and that is not unique to me. The people in grief support will say that. We were best friends, and I never hear from her anymore.
Oh my gosh.
They do. They leave, and then new people come in. But I would ask them specifically, you know, I'm free this week. Is there something that I can help you do? Do you need something done at your house? Or would you like to go out for lunch on Thursday?
Yeah.
You know, give specifics, not, well, I'll call you sometime.
Yeah.
We know how that is with people.
Oh,
we need it. What do you say when you meet someone in a store that you haven't seen? We'll have to get together sometime.
Oh, yeah.
And we don't mean it.
Right.
It's you know, but mean it.
Or maybe you do.
Maybe you do, but you're not going to follow through. You mean it. You're sincere about the desire,
right?
But you don't follow through with it.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, be sincere in both.
Yeah. And
let them know that you're present for how they want you to be present.
Yeah, that's good.
That would be what I'd say, and pray for them.
Yeah.
Pray for them that they would know God's comfort, that they would have supportive family and friends, and that they would see that their life is not over.
That's good. That's because that gives them hope.
Gives them hope.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm getting emotional. Well, I do know why, because this is a difficult topic.
It is a hard topic.
When you're watching a loved one walk through it, it is hard.
It's painful. It is painful to be the person who's walking in pain, and it's painful to watch someone you love in pain and know that you can't fix anything.
Yeah.
You can't fix it, and you can't change it, but yet God doesn't change, and He is willing to work in your life and loves you more than He loves that person more than you do.
Good point. That's a good point. Okay, so Marilyn's book, Hope for Widows, Reflections on Mourning, Living, and Change, is available on Amazon.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Christian Book. Yep.
Okay.
A lot of places.
So I hope you'll go check it out. And also, one thing that my mom did after she became a widow, a lady that went to my church had a book that helped her a lot when her husband passed away unexpectedly. And she gave me the book to give to my mom.
Mm-hmm.
And it impacted my mom so much and helped her so much that every time she heard of a widow after that, well, actually, she had me buy 6 books at a time, because it's like all of a sudden you start noticing.
Yes, you do.
The widows. And so she would give those ladies that. So this, I think, is especially if it's coming from a widow,
Mm-hmm.
because they know that, hey, what this book says is true and has helped me,
right.
Then I encourage widows to purchase this. And then if it's something that has really helped you, then purchase it for somebody that you know has recently become a widow to help
Mm-hmm.
them. Or maybe they've been a widow for a little while but are still struggling.
Right.
So I think it's a great ministry that you have, Marilyn, because no matter what all those editors or publishers or whatever said, it is something that people need to have hope
Mm-hmm.
after they've gone through a difficult time. So thank you so much. And can people follow you on social media?
I have an author page on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, and I have a website, MarilynNutter.com. And on that website, I blog every couple of weeks, but there are grief resources on that website. If people want to take a look, there are articles that they could click on and download. There are other podcasts that I've been interviewed on, which have other things, some of the same things we've talked about, but we've gone in other directions because we can never really totally discuss the concept and the topic, rather, of grief. So that would be something else they could look at.
Yeah, that's really good. Also, if you haven't heard Marilyn and April's interview from episode 35, I was listening to it again this morning. So it's been 2 years since I listened to it, and it was so good. So it's can't remember the exact title, but what to do when your life falls apart.
Destination Hope.
Yeah, and the
travel companion when life falls apart.
Yeah, that's the book that we talked about. But there's a lot of hard things that people go through life, and there's a lot of different reasons to grieve, and so that's what that episode is about. So if you haven't seen or you haven't listened to that one, then go back and listen to that, because you're going to be blessed by that too. So thank you so much, Marilyn.
Thank you so much for having me, Carol.